Hello, Deacon Aspirants. My name is Dr. Timothy Milinovich, and what I hope to do today is go over some of the major dates and some of the major historical events that are in the background of the development of the canon in the Old and New Testament. So this is going to be worthwhile for any Intro to Scripture course. A lot of it has to do with the Old Testament, but also what happens after the Old Testament and after the New Testament in terms of how the canon comes together and how the Catholic Church viewed Scripture and interpreted it. So without further ado, let's go ahead and look at some of the major players. The first major event, to put this in historical context, is to view the covenant with Abraham and the beginning of the biblical story of salvation. It's happening around 1850 BCE, BC. This figure of Abraham is going to be the central figure for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It's through Abraham and through his descendants that God will seek to bring all of humanity back into the fold in God's view for salvation. Abraham will have two sons. The legitimate son, Isaac, will then carry the promise and hand the promise and the blessing on to his second son, Jacob, who will be renamed Israel, and from him you have the 12 tribes of Israel. This brings us to the next major event 600 years later, more or less, with Exodus and the Sinai event, roughly around 1250 before the Common Era. This is the major event where God redeems the Israelites from slavery in Egypt and brings them to Mount Sinai, where the Israelites make a covenant with God. This will be known as the Mosaic Covenant, because Moses is the mediator and basically the representative of the people of Israel for that event. Exodus 19 has a lot of the formal language, a lot of the imagery that you see later on in the Passover meal, in the Last Supper in Mark 14. It's an ancient covenant ritual. It has roughly 620 stipulations that are given at Sinai that make up a lot of the commands that are in the Torah. And this will be, of course, a major part of what we'll talk about in this course. The Israelites are to keep the land and to keep the promise and the blessing so long as they keep the covenant. If they do not keep the covenant, there is always the chance that they can lose that blessing, that protection, and of course, the land. Righteousness in this case means being in right relationship, having basically keeping up to the stipulations of Sinai and maintaining the expectations of that relationship. As soon as they get into the Promised Land, getting to the Promised Land wasn't easy, but even once they're in, this 200-year period that's seen in the book of Judges is presented as something of a dystopia. The Israelites are not good at all at maintaining their relationship, and the entire point of the book of Judges seems to be to say the Israelites could not do this as a confederacy of tribes. They couldn't do this with local judges. They needed a king, which will become, from chapter 16 of 1 Samuel on, the form of government that Israel chooses and that decides its future for the rest of the books of Samuel and Kings. Now that you have this monarchy, Saul was the first king. His reign didn't go so well. Then you have David and his rise to power, and David will be remembered as the most significant king for ancient Israel. His big claim to fame, of course, other than consolidating those tribes into one kingdom, is his wish to build a temple. And from this desire, although he doesn't build it, his son will, his wish to build God a temple that's credited to him ends up leading to this major scene in 2 Samuel 7, where God promises that an heir of David will always sit on his throne. That implies a great deal for Jerusalem and Judah. If there's always going to be a throne then that means there's always going to be a king. If there's always going to be a king, that means there's always going to be a kingdom. So that implies a lot for Jerusalem and Judah. And on the one hand, this is great, and it will look very promisingly for in the future, whenever bad things do happen, Israelites and Judeans will be able to look back and say, we will have the promise of a king to rise up. And that's where you get the hope for the Messiah in the future. But it can also lead to a great deal of complacency. A lot of the prophets dealt with Judeans and Israelites who said, we don't need to worry about anything. God has promised that Jerusalem will always stand. We will always have a king. And that creates a lot of challenges as well. One of the first challenges is after Solomon's death, Solomon had used a lot of conscripted labor from the north, and the northern tribes decide to secede. So the north secedes from the south. Northern tribes now take the title of the Kingdom of Israel, and the south, which is basically just Judah and the tribe of Benjamin, will take the title of the Kingdom of Judah. They are all Israelites, but the north calls itself Israel, and the south calls itself Judah. The north, while it was the more economically viable, the more important, the more prominent area, ends up falling first to the major imperial power of Assyria. And this will be blamed for a number of reasons on its tendencies to go away from proper worship. That, of course, all comes from the south. But the north falls around 722 to Assyria, and this will change the trajectory for the history of Judah and of its theology. From here on out, Judah will look at what happened in the north as a reason for it not to break the covenant. Of course, challenges still arise. It's at this time that the prophets Amos, Hosea, Micah, and the first part of Isaiah, those first 39 chapters, likely were written in response to Assyria. Assyria does take out the north. It takes out a lot of the south, but Jerusalem, while it becomes subservient to Assyria, remains standing. It is not destroyed as a city. The kings after 722 in Jerusalem will have to be subordinate to Assyria. Will have to worship the way Assyria wants them to. Will have to keep Assyrian culture. And that creates a lot of challenges and even causes some maybe Assyrian gods or statues to have been set up in the temple itself. King Josiah, however, when he comes to power in 620, is dealing with a much weaker Assyria. Assyria is imploding. It's in the situation of civil war. And so King Josiah at this time is able to institute a reform in how the temple works and how worship occurs in the temple. And he goes about fixing what he sees as fixing a number of things. Some of it's pretty violent. What ends up happening wherever Josiah got his ideas, 2 Kings 18, and the ideas that he presents there for what he wants his reform to be, sure looks a lot like the book of Deuteronomy and everything that appears to be going on there. So what we can see is from Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, the books of Samuel, and the books of Kings, there seems to be an overall interest in presenting Josiah as following this Deuteronomic code. And the whole of these texts, what we sometimes call the Deuteronomistic history, seems to present Josiah as the pinnacle king for doing what was right. However, even Josiah isn't able to save the south. Its not keeping of the covenant, both in worship and mistreatment of the poor and social injustice, ends up leading it to break the covenant to an extent that God says, okay, we're starting over. It's going to be at this time that the prophets Nahum, Zephaniah, and Habakkuk preach about Babylon coming in. Jeremiah, of course, preaches for a long span from Josiah's early reign all the way to the fall of Judah. And Ezekiel will preach as well in exile. The exile is kind of in two stages. There's a preliminary exile where Babylon comes in, takes a lot of the leaders, moves them out. And then there is a much bigger exile after the puppet king Jehoiakim rebels against Babylon. Babylon comes in and wipes out the city of Jerusalem, destroys it, there's nothing left, destroys the temple. And this is now a major national traumatic moment from which all of Jewish theology will change from here on in, and it will be one of the most significant moments up until the time when the second temple falls and the time of Jesus. It will be the most significant historical event to impact the theology of the Bible to this point. One of the things that happens is not only is the temple destroyed, not only are people taken into exile, but now the Jewish people, the people from Judah, who are now taken into exile in Babylon and start to refer to themselves as Jews, will now look at their tradition and say, look at what we had in the temple. And they'll start to retroject, just as we sometimes, it's when a relationship ends, we look back fondly on that time. Same thing with the Jewish people. When their temple was destroyed and they're in exile, they look back on the temple and rethink and reimagine the worship tradition and their national identity that happened at that time. Perhaps even retrojecting what they needed to see in not having a temple back into the time with Moses, with the tent of meeting and the other rituals that are imagined in the books of Exodus, Leviticus, and Numbers. However it worked out, this is a significant time and a significant theological development that takes place where the faith now becomes much more nationalized and focused on national customs as representing faith identity and faith expression. From 500 to 400, there's significant rebuilding. After Cyrus and the Persians take over and conquer Babylon, the Jews are allowed to return to Jerusalem and rebuild. They're going to rebuild now the temple, which will now be called the Second Temple, and there are debates whether or not how to build the temple, how much money to invest in that, and what to do with it. The prophets Haggai and Zechariah, and what we call Third Isaiah, will debate how to build the temple, whether they should build the temple first or focus more on the infrastructure and take care of the poor who have moved in. And then there's also a debate about who are the Jewish people in relation to non-Jews. And what happened during the exile was holiness and national identity became merged, and that holiness now became seen as a biological reality that prohibited intermarriage. People like Ezra, Nehemiah, these texts very much oppose intermarriage and see that as something that would end up causing a Jewish man to lose his property if he had non-Jewish wife or non-Jewish children. However, the books of Jonah and Ruth, which were probably written around this time, promote intermarriage and actually promote the concept that God cares about all human beings and point back to the view of Abraham that, yes, God is picking a particular people here, but he's picking a particular people in order to expand it out to all people and to regain all of humanity. The next major event, and this will be one of the biggest in Israelite history, is, and for the New Testament as well, is Alexander the Great coming in and everyone having to learn Greek. This will be one of the most significant events for the ancient Jewish people and for the ancient Mediterranean as a whole. This kind of, to a degree, closes what we would see as the Hebrew era and will now open a new era for the Old Testament, for the ending of the Old Testament and the beginning of the New Testament, which is something that we'll cover in the next video as we get into the New Testament and after.